Good morning. I am Deborah Stanhill, the chair of the Mayan Emerging Scholar Fellowship Committee. We are very excited to be starting the second year of our Emerging Scholar Fellowship with this year's fellow, Neti. It's wonderful to see so many of you who participated last year return to learn with us again. For those of you who are new to this initiative at Mayan, I'd like to direct you to this flyer with information on the back, or to the Mayan website for even more information. Before we start, a few thank yous and a few introductions. First, I want to introduce Talia Grinboim, our new Director of Education and Engagement. Please join me in welcoming her to the Mayan family, and feel free to introduce yourselves. Second, I want to welcome Rivi Kotenik, table, Neti's mentor for this class, who flew from Seattle to be here as part of the Emerging Scholar Fellowship Program. Rivi is a recognized exceptional Jewish educator and recently retired as head of school of the Seattle Hebrew Academy. As mentor, Rivi has worked with Neti on class design and pedagogy for this class, and will be meeting with her again to discuss takeaways for Neti to use as she plans her next class on February 4th. Sorry, I know it's a long time, but that was the way the calendar worked out. I want to thank Talia, Guryanovich Mayan President, and Lital Kaufman, our Director of Finance and Operations, for all the hard work that went into preparing today's class. The members of the Emerging Scholarship Committee, Debbie Batesh, Ziva Hassenfeld, and Sybil Levison, for the careful and thoughtful work that they all do for this program. The Maimonides Kahila for this co-sponsorship of today's class and the help they gave us this morning. The Mayan board members who helped in various ways, Emma Stitcher, Laura Cantor, Eileen Hubens, Sybil Levison, Guryanovich, and Andrew Schwartz, as well as the entire Mayan board for their support of this initiative. One logistical note, the class in March is almost definitely going to be rescheduled for a week later, March 16th instead of March 9th. We hope you can all join us for this special co-ed class on Motzei Shabbat. If you've made a note on your calendar, please also note the change. This fellowship is funded outside of Mayan's operating budget, so a special thank you to our foundational donors who ensured we could create this program. There are many calls on our funds right now, but I hope that this innovative project to support emerging female Torah scholars become skilled adult educators speaks to you. You will help us support it. Thank you. It goes without saying that all of us are spending a lot of time thinking about events in Israel and doing whatever we can to help. In that spirit, we are dedicating our Torah learning this morning to the well-being of Israel's soldiers, the speedy release of the hostages, and the memory of those who were killed. In particular, we bear in mind Yosef Gedalia, Yosef Malachi ben David Bedina, Zichron Kadosh Libracha, the grandson-in-law of founding Mayan board member and first president Helen Wegline, son-in-law of Shmuel Wegline and Nora Mazar, who are members of the Brookline community, and husband of their daughter Sinai, an alumna of the school. May the zechut of our learning bring an aliyah to his neshama. Now to our class. Please welcome Neti Penstein as our Emerging Scholar Fellow and our teacher this morning. Her bio is on the sheet. Neti impressed the committee with her emerging love of teaching, her substantive Torah knowledge, and her passion for Torah. Neti, we are excited to learn with you. Please come and teach us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I spent a lot of time in the Maimonides School last year as a Maimonides Fellow, so it was exciting to come back in this capacity. And in line with what Deborah said to start us off, I also wanted to kind of frame the learning that we're going to be doing this morning in terms of what I think is preoccupying all of our minds, which is what's happening right now to our brothers and sisters in Israel. And I want to focus in on the notion of Torah learning, Be'it Zara, learning Torah in a time of distress. Because I think what we've been hearing about a lot, and rightly so, is the notion of Tefillah Be'it Zara. That during times of great distress for the Jewish people, prayer takes on a special status. Right? The Ramban, Nachmanides, generally thinks that prayer is only a rabbinic obligation, except in times of great need and crisis, that prayer becomes a biblical obligation. It takes on a new status. But what I think is lesser known is that the Ramban doesn't just say this about tefillah, he also says this about Talmud Torah. So if you take a look at the very first thing on the source sheets, I underline for you that when Ramban discusses this, he says, Shemiklal ha'avodah shenomod Torah v'shenitpalel elav b'it hatzarot. That the two things that we have to do in times of distress is to learn Torah and to daven to God. And he goes on to explain, what does this do? Tiyena ininu v'livinu elav levado ki'inei avadim al yad adonehem. That our hearts and our eyes should be focused solely on God, like the eyes of a servant to his master. And I think we can understand how this works in prayer. That's our stance in prayer. We're looking at God as the person who supplies all of our needs. But this isn't usually how we think of Talmud Torah. We think about it as engaging with God, being in dialogue with God. So what exactly does the Ramban mean? So one of my rebbeim in GPATs actually suggested that perhaps what the Ramban is saying here is that when we learn Torah, what we're trying to do is uncover the Ratzon Hashem, the will of God. And when we turn to Hashem and we say, God, we want to understand your Ratzon, we want to know your will, implicit in that is a prayer on our parts. God, we're trying to understand your will, please in return try to understand our will, and try to bring us that speedy salvation that we're all praying for. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the Torah that we're going to be learning this morning. And the topic that I've chosen is Korban. But I don't want to begin with the question of why we bring Korban. Not because I don't think that's a valuable question. I actually think it's a very valuable question and a very important one to ask. But because I think that because the system of Korbanos is so complex and intricate, it's not really a starting point. We have to first gain an understanding of the details of the various laws before we can kind of ask this broader question about it. And so I want to start from the inside, from an understanding of one particular Korban, and that's the Korban Olah, or the burnt offering. And the question that I want to deal with in this year is a rather simple one. What is the purpose of the Olah? Why is it brought? And what goal does it achieve? And we know that Korbanos don't just appear all of a sudden out of nowhere in Sefer Vayikra. Even before Matan Torah, people are bringing Korbanos in a spontaneous, non-ritualized fashion. And so I have for you 4 pesukim, which are the 4 times in pre-Matan Torah when the Korban Olah specifically was brought. And so what I want to ask, if everyone's okay with it, is for you to actually turn to the person sitting next to you for a few minutes and read these 4 pesukim and keep the following questions in mind. In each pasuk, what is the purpose of the Olah? Why do you think it's being brought? And then also, if you have any kind of knowledge, anything that you've ever learned or heard about the Korban Olah that you can remember and share with your partner, also kind of bring that up. And so I'll give you guys around 2 minutes to learn. I know that's not enough time, but we're going to do it anyways. Maybe 2.5. We'll see how it's going. I'll walk around. To learn these pesukim. And I gave some context on top for all the pesukim. Sorry, I'm going to call everyone back. That was actually 3 minutes, so I did give a little bit of extra time. Sorry. I know that there's a lot to say about these different pesukim, but I was kind of walking around listening to what people said, so I'm going to try to kind of pull together some of the different things that I heard going around. And I think one of the sentiments that I heard, which is very true, is that it's not clear that there's one very specific purpose that we can point to that the Olah is being brought here. It seems as though in all of these cases, it's some sort of symbol of general avodah Hashem, wanting to worship God, wanting to express this notion of sacrificing, giving a gift, offering something to God. And one of the distinguishing features of Olah, what distinguishes it from other Korbanos, does anyone want to jump in? This is maybe something that isn't necessarily in the pesukim, but might just be something that you know, that you've heard of, that you've learned about the Olah. Exactly, and it's the only korban like that. All other korbanot, there's parts that are eaten either by the priest, by the kohanim, or maybe even also by the person bringing it, but the olah is not like that. And if you take a look at the underlined parts of the pesukim, the verb to describe the olah is always vaya'al olot, or vaya'al lubu, the olah, and that's because this word vaya'al is to elevate, to bring up, because the olah is totally brought up. So it seems very likely that that's where it gets its name from, the fact that it's totally brought up to heaven, and that it's this kind of, I wouldn't say generic in a bad sense, but general way of symbolizing one's desire to serve and to sacrifice to God. And perhaps the most prominent example of that is the fact that the Olah is the Korban of the Yahidah. When Abraham is asked to prove his willingness to sacrifice his most beloved possession, his son, to God, it's with a Korban Olah, this completely burnt sacrifice. And so the question is, when Korbanot do become part of Jewish ritual, an official part of the Jewish ritual, does the Olah maintain this identity, or does the Torah innovate it or update it in any way? So if we look at Vayikra, Parak Aleph, as I mentioned, the very first Korban that's introduced to us is the Korban Olah. Right after we're told in pesukim Aleph and Bet about the idea of Korbanot and the very possibility of sacrificing to God, we're told in Pasuk Gimel about the Olah. Olah Korbano min habakar zachar tamim yakrivenu al patach ohamoed. That if the individual wants to bring an Olah, he can bring it from cattle. It should be a male, unblemished, and he should bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And then the Torah tells us that yakriv oto lirtzono lifnei Hashem. That he should bring it lirtzono according to his will, meaning voluntarily before God. So far this aligns with what we have kind of thought about the Olah, that it's this voluntary act of sacrifice to God. And if you skip down for a moment to Pasuk Tet, the Torah describes v'hiktir hakohen et hakol hamizbecha, that the Kohen burns the entire thing on the Mizbeach, which is again what we noted about the Olah, that its distinguishing feature is being completely burnt. But if we go back to the Pasuk that I skipped, here is where things start to get surprising. Because here the Torah introduces a totally new element to the Korban Olah, that to be honest, is I think very unexpected. So the Torah tells us, v'samach yado al rosh ha'olah, that the person bringing the Olah performs something known as smicha, which is to place his hands on the animal. And then it tells us, v'nirtzeh lo, it's accepted on his behalf, l'chaper alav, to atone for him. Now, since when was the individual that was bringing this Korban seeking atonement? Did we see any mention of this individual sinning before he brought this Korban and hoping to achieve atonement? And what is he achieving atonement for? It just uses this word, l'chaper alav, to atone for him. But for what? What did he do wrong? And I think if we look at the way that the Torah describes another Korban, the sin offering, or the Korban Chatas, where it's very clear that that Korban is directed at sin, we can appreciate how unusual the kapara of Olah is in its description. Because if you look at source 6, at the pesukim that describe the Chata, Pasuk Bet tells us right off the bat, Nefesh ki tichteh bishgaga, when a person commits an accidental sin, and it goes on to explain what kind of sin this is. So the moment that we start reading about the Chata, we already know that an individual has sinned, and that's why they're bringing this Korban. And if you look all the way down at Pasuk Chavav, when the individual brings the Korban, the Torah is explicit, the kiper alav ha-kohen mechatato. The Kohen atones for him from his sin. And so the kapara is directly connected to a sin that the individual committed. And so the kapara aspect of Olah is unusual for two reasons. The first reason is that there's no preface of if you sin, you must bring this Korban. In fact, we're told that it's voluntary. Yakrivo told so no. You can bring it when you want. It's not a necessary step to achieving atonement. And the second reason that it's unusual is because unlike for the Chata, where we're told that it's atoning for a specific sin, when it comes to the Olah, there's no evidence that it's atoning for a specific sin. But on that second point of what is the Olah atoning for, what sin is it atoning for, the Midrashim jump in and try to answer that for us. They try to fill in the missing information in this pasuk. So Rashi in source 7 quotes the Torah Kohanim, which essentially uses process of elimination to try to figure out what Olah could be atoning for. Rashi, the Midrash goes through different things that we already know, how they're atoned for, the punishments that they have, or the korbanos that we bring for them. And then all the way at the end, in the third to last line, the Midrash concludes, what must Olah atone for? Ha inu meratza el al aseh, va'alav shen itak la'aseh. It must be that Olah atones for an aseh, a positive commandment, Now, of course, we don't mean performing a positive commandment, right? We mean failing to perform a positive commandment. And something known as a lav shenitat la'aseh, which literally means a prohibition connected to a positive commandment. So there are certain commandments in the Torah where we're told not to do something, but we're told that if we do that, there's a certain mitzvah that we should do to fix that. So a classic example is stealing. There's a pasuk that says, lo tigzol, you cannot steal, but what happens if you do steal? V'hishiva tagzila asher gazal. You have a mitzvah to return the stolen object which you stole. And Chazal refer to this as a lav shenitat la'aseh, and the rule is that because you have a positive commandment to fulfill, we actually don't punish you. We don't give you the typical punishment for prohibition, which is lashes. Instead, we say, work on performing this mitzvah that you have. So the Midrash assumes that these two things are what Olah is providing atonement for. And in terms of the first idea, the idea of failing to do a positive commandment, nowhere in the Torah does it mention what the penalty is for not doing a positive commandment, with actually the exception of not bringing a Korban Pesach and Brit Milah, which we know are kind of severe examples. But aside from that, we know that we're supposed to put up a mezuzah, that we're supposed to sit in the sukkah on sukkahs, blow the shofar. We know that we're supposed to do all those things, but we're never told what's the consequence if we don't. And so the Midrash makes a very sensible assumption, well, there must be some kind of consequence. And here we have this generic kapara. We don't understand what it's atoning for. We should put them together. It must be that it's atoning for the aseh, for the failure to do the positive commandment, and for this other type of prohibition that doesn't get a punishment. And that's what the Torah Kohanim says. And the Midrash Haggadah in Vayikra, building on that, offers a third possibility, a third category of offenses that Olah atones for. The Midrash says, Im Olah Korbano, Zoha Olah, Hi al Hirhure Haliv. This Korban Olah is for thoughts of the heart. Shena'amar ha'olah al ruchechem. As the pasuk says, that which enters your spirit or your mind. And if you take a look at the next source, the pasuk in Yechezkel, the Midrash is building off of the pasuk in Yechezkel, which uses the phrase ha'olah al ruchechem to speak about thoughts that enter one's mind. And this Midrash suggests that the name Olah is maybe a reference to this idea of thoughts, which are things that kind of enter or rise up into our minds. So before we suggested that an Olah might be called an Olah because it entirely goes up to God, and now this Midrash offers an alternative, that it's called Olah because of its capacity to atone for sinful thoughts. And if you look in source 10 at the pesukim in Iyov, the Yerushalmi actually quotes this pasuk in Iyov as proof that this is what the Olah was being used for. Because in the first parak of Iyov, we're told all of the incredible things that Iyov did, why he was this most perfectly righteous man. And one of his merits was that after he would have a feast with his entire family, the Torah tells us that Ha'ala Olo Mispar Kulam, that he would bring Olo from each and every person in his family. Why? Ki Amar Iyov Ulai Chatu Banai Uberchu Elokim B'Lavav. Because Iyov said, maybe my son sinned and I didn't realize. Why didn't I realize? Because they did it in their hearts, right? Blessing God is a euphemism for not blessing God, exactly. If Iyov is worried, perhaps my sons sinned in their hearts, and I don't know about it, so I'll bring these Olo to atone for that. And that's evidence to the Yerushalmi that an Olah must atone for sinful thoughts. And it's not clear exactly what the nature of these thoughts are. It might be thoughts of doing sin, right? Hirhure might be planning, I'm like thinking in my head how I'm gonna acquire this object to do a certain sin with. That's what Chazal refer to generally as Hirhure Aveira. It could also perhaps be referring to sinful thoughts on a more theological level, perhaps waning in faith or doubting God in some problematic capacity. But either way, we wondered when we read the pesukim, what does Olah atone for? And now we have three different answers from Chazal, three categories of things. These might seem a little random. I hope by the end of this class to show you how they're really not random at all. But for now it seems that we have some kind of plausible theory about what the Olah is. Before Matan Torah, it might just have been about bringing a gift to God and expressing one's desire to sacrifice, to submit oneself to God. But now, post Matan Torah, the Olah takes on this new quality as a korban of kapara, a korban that offers atonement. And this theory is borne out by the next Gemara, the Gemara in source 7 in Yoma. because the Gemara in Source 7 treats the Olah as a standard korban of kapara, as a standard korban that offers atonement. The Gemara is discussing the procedure that I mentioned before, known as smicha, as placing one's hands on the animal. And what happens during the process of smicha is that the individual recites vidoy, or a confession. And so the Gemara explains that you do this vidoy, this confession, when you're bringing a korban that came along with a certain sin. So if you skip down a few lines, the Gemara says that you confess on your sacrifice. And what do you confess? So al chatat avu chatat. If you bring a korban chatat, the sin offering, you confess the specific sin attached for that. Al asham avun asham, right? An asham, a guilt offering, also is brought for specific sins. So you confess that sin. And then al olah, when it comes to an olah, avun leket shichacha v'paya v'meiser ani divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So we're not going to go into the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. I know it sounds very different from everything that we've seen. It's actually not different at all. It's likely that Rabbi Yossi Haglili is just saying that he thinks that those things that I just listed are types of mases and not exactly. But we'll read Rabbi Akiva, will sound very familiar to us, because this is essentially the answer that we saw in Borat's Kohanim. Rabbi Akiva Omer, in ula ba'a ela al-aseh, va'al lo taseh shemitat la'aseh. That when one brings the olah, they confess the sin of a positive commandment or a prohibition attached to a positive commandment. And so we see here something really surprising, which maybe at this point is less surprising, the equation between the chatat and the olah. Both are korbanot brought to atone for specific sins. Now, not all korbanot make this list in Yoma. Not all korbanot have a vidoy, have a confession on them. There's a korban shlomim, which is a peace offering, that's certainly not brought for any sin whatsoever. And the Rambam Maimonides actually suggests that when one brings a shlomim, they should recite praises to God when they do the smicha of placing the hands. And we might have thought that olah would have fit into that category, but now we see that olah is different, that olah also has atonement. And we might wonder why the atonement is presented in such a specific, unusual way. But for now, we have sort of the starts of a simple theory about the purpose of olah. But the problem is that if we take a look at the other Gemaras and the way that they relate to the olah, we see that this theory doesn't seem to bear out at all. And that on the contrary, in numerous places, the Gemara actually contrasts the chatat and the olah on these very grounds. And the Gemara thinks that chatat is what offers atonement, and olah, of course, doesn't offer any atonement. And so take a look in the Mishnah, in source number 12 of the Mishnah in Zvachef. The Mishnah is dealing with cases where a Kohen has different animals before him, different korbanot before him, and he's trying to figure out what takes precedent. In his to-do list for the day, what should he be bringing first? And the Mishnah formulates the general rule that kol ha-mekudash mechaviro kodem et chaviro, that whatever is more sanctified than the other thing should come before it. And then the Mishnah gives an example. Dam chatat kodem ledam olah mipnei shehu merata. That the blood of the chatat gets sprinkled before the blood of the olah. The sprinkling of the blood is part of the procedure of bringing the korban, and chatat comes first. Why? Because chatat atones, said the Gemara. There's a much more urgent need to bring the chatat, which provides atonement, than there is to bring the Korban Olah. And so what are we meant to do with this Mishnah? Based on everything we just said, this Mishnah doesn't seem to make any sense. How can we say that Olah isn't mirata, that it doesn't offer kapara? Didn't the pasuk say, "V'nirtza lo lechaper alav"? Didn't the Mishnah say that you're supposed to confess on an Olah the sins of an Olah? So what are we meant to make of this Mishnah? So one theoretical possibility is to say, well, the Mishnah is focusing on the blood. Maybe the blood of the Olah isn't what atones, but something else atones. So in theory, that's actually a very good idea, but in practicality, it's not plausible at all. Because the Gemara, in a number of places, formulates a fundamental principle, which we're not going to have time to explain and get into. I wish we could. It's going to sound perhaps a little esoteric, but the principle is that in kapara ela b'dam, that the step of the korban that's meant to achieve the atonement is the blood and the sprinkling of the blood. And so if Olah is atoning the way that Chatat is, we would expect it to be the dam of the Olah, the blood of the Olah, that's atoning. So another option that's always available to us when we're learning Torah and we come up with two different things that seem to contradict each other, is to say it's a machloket. Maybe there's a disagreement, right? Maybe this Mishnah is expressing the view of one Tana, one Mishnaic sage, who held this particular view about Olah, that Olah doesn't offer atonement. But the problem is that this doesn't seem to be a one-off view of one sage. As I'll show you in the upcoming sources, this idea appears over and over again, and in ways that make it very clear that there's not a machloket about this. There's not a disagreement. This is just a logical thing that the rabbis all sort of accepted about the Olah. So if you take a look at source number 13 at the Gemara in Chulen, and I want to give a shout out to Sarah Wertheimer because we actually learned this Gemara together in Migdalos. When I heard she was coming, I was like, wow, I think I learned this with her. So it's a Gemara in the beginning of Chulen. We were not dealing with this question necessarily when we read the Gemara, so this will be it from a different lens. And the Gemara is discussing the halacha, the law that a mumar, someone who's an apostate, who's rejected the entire system of Torah and mitzvot, if they try to bring a korban, we don't accept their korban from them. And the Gemara gives a source for this. Mikem, the pasuk said, Adam mikem, right, when one of you wants to bring a korban. So the word one from you, v'lo kolcha, implies not all of you. Not every person can bring a korban. L'hotzi et hamumar. So this comes to exclude the mumar, the apostate, from bringing a korban. And then a little later on, the Gemara wonders, Veha mihacha nafka? Is that really the source for the exclusion of the mumar, of the apostate? Mehatam nafka. Me'am ha'aretz pra l'mumar. The Gemara quotes another similar pasuk that says right from among the populace, which comes to exclude the mumar. Because again, the idea is the mem, the from, meaning not every single person. And so then the Gemara tells us that these two pesukim are written in two different contexts. Chada bechatat, the second one, the ma'am ha'aretz, is written in the context of chatat, v'chada be'olah, but the first one is written in the context of olah. And this explains why we need both. Because chatat and olah are so fundamentally different that if we had only known this halacha in one context, we wouldn't have assumed it for the other context. V'tzrichi, says the Gemara, they're both necessary. D'i ashma'inan chatat, because had I only known that we don't accept a chatat from a sin offering, from a mumar, mishum dilakapara. I would have said, well, the reason that we don't accept a chatat from them is because a chatat provides atonement. But when an individual expresses to us very blatantly that they have no desire to keep Torah and mitzvot, and they're going to leave the Beit HaMikdash and continue along their sinful path, we don't give them this opportunity to atone. It's almost insulting to the process of atonement to allow such an individual to attain atonement. And so if the halacha had only been stated in the context of chatat, I would have said, oh yeah, that halacha makes perfect sense for a chatat. Aval olah, but when it comes to an olah, did doron hu, the word doron means a gift, which is a gift to God. Why should we stop this individual from bringing a gift to God, says the Gemara. And so what we see is, again, this treatment of the chatat as focused on kapara. The chatat is about atonement. But what's the olah about? It's not atonement at all. It's what we thought of when we read the early pre-Matan Torah pesukim, that an olah is a gift to God. And now, I like this Gemara because it gives us a name for the other option, right? One of our options is kapara, and now we have a name for this other option, which is doro, which is giving a gift to God. And so what do we do with this piece of evidence? And I think here, we can't attribute it to one particular sage. We can't just say, this is again a machloket, because this is just the stam, the anonymous voice of the Gemara reasoning things out. And so it seems like we're using principles that everyone just agrees to. And so I think sometimes when you get lots of mixed evidence, right? Here we have our evidence on the kapara side is the words of kapara lav and the pesukim, the two Midrashim that we saw, right? The Torah Kohanim and the Midrash Haggadah, the Gemara that talked about the confession that you make on the Olah, that we have on one side. And now on the other side, we have the Mishnah talking about chatat coming first, and now this other Gemara speaking about the need for two separate pesukim, because chatat is kapara and olah isn't. And so what what we might have to do now is take a step back and say, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe these two options that I'm kind of presenting to you, you're not asking the wrong question, I'm asking the wrong question, as two mutually exclusive options of kapara on the one hand and doron on the other hand. Maybe it isn't just these two options. Maybe there's something else. But what is that something else? And so what I want to do now is try to answer that by looking at two more Gemaras that also seem to be making the same assumption that Chatat is about kapara and Olah is a doron. But in these two Gemaras, we have something that we don't have in the previous two Gemaras, which is an acknowledgement of the counter evidence. We have some sort of acknowledgement that there is some kind of atonement feature within Olah, and it's through seeing how the Gemara acknowledges and deals with the counter evidence that we can build the picture of this third model, this something else model that we have. So if you take a look at the Gemara in Erfen, sorry, it's actually...
Can I just ask a question?
Of course, yes.
A clarifying question before we move forward. Okay, so the Gemara in Kuli does not mention the Mishnah, right?
Right.
Okay, so and you're proposing that it has an implicit resolution? Meaning, put for us the Gemara and Kuli in conversation with the Mishnah in Zabati.
So both of them assume that Chatat has kapara, whereas Olah doesn't. So the Mishnah in Zvachim tells us that if you have, thank you for the question, I appreciate it. So both of them tell us that the Gemara in Zvachim, the Mishnah, sorry, in Zvachim tells us that if you have the blood of Chatat and the blood of an Olah, and you have to figure out which one should I bring first, we should go with the Chatat, because the blood of the Chatat offers atonement and kapara, whereas the Olah does not. And that's the same assumption that we see here in the Gemara in Chulin, where the Gemara says, a Chatat has kapara, so I would understand why we wouldn't accept a Chatat from someone who wants to sin again right after bringing it. But an Olah is a doron, and therefore I wouldn't necessarily know that I have to, that I can't include someone who's willfully sinning. Yeah.
Is the assumption that we've been working with all along that kapara is always for a sin?
Amazing. Hold that thought. It's great.
It's only for what?
She said only for a sin.
Yeah.
Amazing. What's her name?
Anne.
Anne. Okay, so Anne is exactly on
The
track.
more mysterious kapara has gotten.
Kapara is very mysterious. Hopefully this will, I guess, perhaps demystify it. I'm not sure. But I don't know if it can be fully demystified. But thank you so much. Really hold that thought. It's excellent. So the Mishnah in Erchen is discussing the circumstances under which the court repossesses property that someone pledged to the temple, right? So if I pledge that I'm going to donate this sheep as a korban, and then we notice that I'm not really doing what I was supposed to do, can the court come into my home and take that property, seize it from me, to make sure that it gets where it needs to go? And so the considerations depend on whether we assume that you're going to be totally derelict in bringing this, or whether we can trust you and we think that you will bring this korban eventually, you just haven't gotten around to it yet. And so the Mishnah says that chayavei chataos v'ashamos in memashkenenotan, chayavei ulot v'shlamim memashkenenotan. So the Mishnah makes a distinction. When it comes to chatat and asham, which are both related to a particular sin, the court does not seize your property if you're delaying. Why? Presumably because we assume that an individual who sinned wants atonement for their sin. And so we're not worried that you're going to be totally derelict and you're going to forget to bring this korban entirely. But when it comes to Olah and Shlamim, the assumption is that both of these types of korbanot do not provide atonement, and therefore, the individual had a moment of spiritual inspiration. They wanted to bring this gift to God, but that kind of faded. They lived far from the Beit HaMikdash, and now they're not really sure whether they want to give up their sheep anymore. And so in those cases, we do repossess the individual's property. And so this would seem to fit in the model that we saw in the previous two sources, that Chatat is atonement and Olah is not. But here, Rashi finally mentions some of the counter evidence, and it's very exciting. I was very excited when I saw this Rashi. Rashi says, Ol v'shlamim, af al gav de Olah v'chaperet a'aseh. Right? Rashi says, even Rashi says that because there's no obligation to bring the Olah, which is something that we noted when we read the pesukim, right? It said, Yakrivo to so no. It's up to you to decide to bring the Olah, unlike a chatat, which we noted is totally obligatory. An individual who sins must bring the chatat. Therefore, says Rashi, lo chashiv la kapara. The individual doesn't really consider this real kapara and atonement, which is interesting, right? Because Rashi's sort of articulating, I think, a tension that we've observed. That on the one hand, there seems to be kapara to olah, but it doesn't seem to be the full-fledged classic chatat model of kapara that we're used to, where you have to do this in order to achieve the atonement. Your atonement doesn't seem to depend and necessitate you bringing the olah.
No, just is the distinction between mitzvot aseh and mitzvot lo ta'aseh? Is that what he's like? In other words, the mitzvot lo ta'aseh are required, and that's a chatat, and the mitzvot aseh are not. I mean, you should do the positive commandments, but if you don't do the positive commandments, whatever, and that's the distinction for an olah, or he's not necessarily making that distinction.
Well, I think it's the distinction that you're making is a very interesting one. I think you're suggesting, right, that there might be something to violating a negative prohibition that doesn't really exist when it comes to, like, just not doing a positive commandment, right? I think I would say a little bit that we definitely have to do positive commandments, right?
Right, yes. I didn't mean to imply that.
Yeah, I wasn't, but I think that Rashi is picking up on the fact when he says law of chova, he's not referring to the commandment, but rather the bringing of the korban, meaning that it's an obligation to bring a chatat, whereas it's not an obligation to bring an olah. I was gonna bring this on the source sheet, but it was getting too long. But if you look in, I guess now saying it is kind of counterproductive to that, but if you look in the Sefer Vayikra, a book that counts the different mitzvot, so it lists the olah as din olah, meaning like the halachot, the details of the olah. Whereas when it comes to chatat, it says, like chiyuv lahavi chatat kasher chatat, the obligation to bring a chatat when you sin. And that kind of very neatly demonstrates this distinction between one that you have to bring and one that you don't. But what you're pointing out about the difference between positive and negative commandments is something that we're going to come back to and explore in great depth. So amazing. Yeah, and
this is just a specific detail in the Rashi.
yeah.
Rashi says lo hashivla. Is he saying that it is not considered, or the person himself would not consider it obligatory, so he may be lax in it, even though if he properly understood it, he would recognize the kapara aspect and therefore be more careful to bring it.
Amazing. So I think it's definitely the subjective. I think you're right. It's right, lo chashiv la kapara, and therefore ati l'shavuyah. Then he will come to delay it. So exactly, as in there is a kapara in an objective sense. There's a kapara aspect to olah, but it doesn't have as much of a weight of sway on the person's psychology exactly because he's not obligated to bring the olah.
So
100%.
Rashi is in fact saying we're not discounting everything I've said before about kapara. It's still true.
Exactly, yes, 100%. And that's why I love this Rashi, because he's bringing us back and he's saying, don't think that just because we're making this comparison, it's some kind of objective comparison. We're just kind of talking about people's psychology, and that kind of highlights the question of, well, why is the kapara of olah different than chatat in this way? Why don't we make you, if you don't do an aseh, why don't we make you bring an olah? So a question that I hope to answer. Yes?
So are the korbanot like public pledges, or it's just something that someone says in their heart? And if it's the second, how do they know to repossess his property?
It's a great question in terms of how they know. You definitely have to say it out loud, meaning you have to actually vocalize the words Harei Zeh Olah or Harei Alai Olah, depending on what kind of.
That's when you're actually bringing.
No, before you bring it. When you designate the animal, you do a verbal designation of the animal. To be honest, I'm not sure how the court would know that you had designated these animals. I don't know, maybe word got around. You find that a lot in the Gemara, that people kind of know each other's business, even right now on social media. But it's a very good question. I genuinely don't know the answer. It's a great question. And to kind of bring us back, and I think to bring us back especially to the point that Anne was making, we do now see this recognition that Olah has kapara, but that the reason that we might not be relating to it as a korban with kapara might have to do with like our own psychology, but also, broadly speaking, might have to do with the fact that the kapara and the atonement of Olah works differently than chata. And the Gemara in the next source is actually dealing with kind of a similar issue as the Gemara here is, but it sort of spells out in even more clear terms exactly what the tension is when we're talking about what the kapara of Olah is all about. So this Gemara is discussing the question, it sounds like a little bit of an esoteric question, but the question of, do we make a prohibition for an individual to benefit from the wool that fell off of an animal that they pledged as a korban before they brought it? So essentially you pledge that you're going to bring your sheep as a korban, but if you live far from Yerushalayim, you might not do that until one of the holidays come up that you have to actually go to Yerushalayim and bring it. And so in that time, your sheep is like shedding a lot, and you want to kind of gather that wool together and make some kind of, I don't know, scarf blanket out of it. So can you do that? So the Gemara says, skipping a few lines in, Semer shenitlash me'ola temima mahir. What is the status of wool that comes from an olah, that comes from a korban olah? And the Gemara explains why we're specifically asking this question about an olah. The chatas ve'asham lo tibaylach. The Gemara says we don't have to ask this question when it comes to our two sin offerings, the chatat and the asham. Why? The kivan de l'kapara atu lo mishahulai. Similar to what we saw previously, that because they provide atonement, we're not worried that an individual is going to say, wait a minute, I should keep this animal in my house for a really long time so I can collect all of its wool, and then they'll really delay and never bring the korban. Because since it's a kapara, we don't feel like we need to motivate you to bring it. We know that you're going to bring it eventually. And similarly, says the Gemara on the flip side, when it comes to bechor v'maser, which are other types of korbanot that do not offer any kapara whatsoever, kivan delav l'kapara atu mishahulai, since they have no kapara whatsoever, we are indeed worried that the individual will keep this animal in his house so he can continue collecting the wool, and therefore we say you can't benefit from the wool. But, says the Gemara, we have a middle category. And now finally, we're relating to Olah as this middle category. What about an Olah? Kiti ba'ilach to Olah mani. What about an Olah? On the one hand, kivan de'ikar lav l'kapara ati. And we're going to really hone in on what exactly this means. But for now, we'll just translate it. Since its primary function is not atonement, mishahilai, are we worried that people are going to be derelict in bringing it? O dilma, kivan de'olah nami mechabra ase, lo mishahilai. Or perhaps, since Olah also provides some atonement, for example, for positive commandments, then maybe you won't delay bringing it. So this Gemara sets up for us very neatly. We have two definite categories. We have certain korbanot that we're sure are kapara, and certain korbanot that we're sure are not kapara. And here's Olah right in the middle, where on the one hand, its primary function seems to not be kapara, but it has what the Gemara seems to be kind of considering its like secondary function, right? It's nami, it also has this function of atoning for a positive commandment. And so we might just say, okay, maybe there's like a dual function. It wears kind of two hats, its primary hat, and it has sort of like this side hustle kind of thing of offering kapara. But if you take a look at how Rashi explains it, Rashi makes it clear that when we say that the Olah's primary function isn't kapara, it's not because the Olah has two different functions. It's because the way that kapara and Olah works isn't the normal primary way. And this gets exactly to Anne's point. Rashi is exactly what you were saying. Rashi says a few words. He says, what does it mean that Olah is not ikar l'kapara? De'ino mivia al-chi. That an Olah is not meant to atone for a specific sin. So when we think about the chatat is totally inextricably linked from start to finish to a sin. Right? The pesukim start by saying, nefesh ki tichta. When a person sins, this is their only recourse, and they must bring the chatat, and the result of bringing the chatat is v'kiper alav mei chatata, that he's atoned for his sin. But what about the Olah? The Olah doesn't start off with, you must sin to bring the Olah. The Olah can be voluntarily offered. And when we address the Olah's kapara, we don't say mechatata, we don't make it kapara, atonement, that's linked to a particular sin. But what is it linked to? V'chiper alav. Olah seems to be kapara, not for what I've done, but for who I am. It's kapara on him, on the person that's bringing it. And I was very excited to discover that Rav Lichtenstein actually has terminology that he uses for these two different types of kapara. He calls it kaparat hachet, kapara for a particular sin, and kaparat hagavra, atoning for the person as a spiritual individual. But what does this mean? That's what we have to explore now. What does it mean to atone for the individual? So if you take a look at the Gemara in Zvachim, I think we're just going to start actually with the last line on this Gemara, which is the statement of Rabbi Shimon. And he, I think, explains for us what kaparat gavra means. So Tanya Nami Hachi, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Chata Lama Ba. Rabbi Shimon says, why does an individual bring a chata? And the Gemara kind of laughs in Rabbi Shimon's face. Lama Ba? What do you mean, why do you bring a chata? L'chaper. It's obvious what the purpose of a chata is. A chata provides atonement. There's a reason, right, that I didn't give this year about what's the purpose of chata, because it would be over by now. Chata is a very obvious korban in that sense. So rather, Rabbi Shimon rephrased this question. He says, no, I was asking a better question, don't worry. Ella lama ba'a lifnei olah. Rabbi Shimon wants to know, why is it that if an individual has a sin offering that they need to bring and an olah that they need to bring, we tell them, bring your chata first. And this is right similar to what we saw in the Mishnah, that if you have the blood of a chata and the blood of an olah, you bring your chata first. But Rabbi Shimon answers by giving a mashal, by giving a parable. He says, "Leparkli shenichnas." It's like an advocate who comes before the king to plead his case and to ask the king for mercy. Ritza parkli nichnas dobron acharav. When this advocate succeeds at pleading his case, and when he gains the favor of the king, what does he do next? He brings the king a gift afterwards. And so, the chata represents advocating, asking the king to forgive a particular sin, and the olah represents the gift given to the king afterwards. And here, we have this word doron, the gift word, our alternative to kapara, being used not necessarily as the opposite of kapara, but as something that comes against the backdrop of kapara. And I think that the distinction that the Gemara is making here is what we might think of as the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. When we do something wrong and we ask someone for forgiveness, we're asking them, don't hold what I did against me, right? Erase it from what you think I've done to you. But that doesn't always necessarily translate to your relationship with the individual being exactly the same as it once was. Even if the individual doesn't hold it against you, things might not still feel the same anymore. But reconciliation is that resuming the relationship as it was. It's bringing back and continuing on normal terms. And I think that's what's going on in this Gemara. An individual might have done a particular sin, and they need atonement for that very specific sin. But after that, they have to address the other consequence of the sin, which is by sinning, they've made distance between themselves and God. And what the olah does is it's the gift that we bring to God to say, please accept us back on the same term. Let's sort of have the same relationship that we once had. It's kind of like a meal that you would have with a friend after having some kind of disagreement, and you want to kind of show both of you that you guys are still friends, you're still on the same page as you once were. And we have to realize that the case that Rabbi Shimon is describing, where the individual first brings a chata and then brings an olah, isn't the normal case of an olah. Usually, an olah is something that comes on its own, meaning that an individual doesn't have to have a particular sin to feel as though they're more distant from God than they would like to be. We can feel like we want to reconcile with God, not because of a particular sin, but just because we sense distance. And that's why the olah is a voluntary korban that can always be brought, because we can always have this sense of wanting to reconcile, to improve upon our relationship with God. And even an individual that doesn't necessarily feel distance from God, the very fact that God is infinite means that there's always room to come closer, and that this is always an option for sort of inspiring to greater spiritual heights. And I think the idea of kaparat hagavra, and we're going to continue to develop this, but the idea of atoning for the person, at least from here, is the notion of sort of cleansing and refining the person's spiritual character so that they can stand closer to God than they had been previously standing. And this explains the mixed evidence that we've seen so far. It explains why, on the one hand, Olah is considered to offer kapara, but why the pesukim don't have any preface of if you sin. Because the kapara of Olah is not tied to a particular sin, and that's why it's v'chiper alav, to atone for him, and not michatatav, not to atone for his sin. And it explains also why when we compare Olah to chatat, we kind of lose the kapara element of Olah. It's only in terms of chatat where it has this very specific sin-directed kapara, the ability to really erase a sin. Olah doesn't really have kapara because Olah doesn't do that. But on its own terms, Olah does have its own unique form of kapara. But there's one piece of evidence that we haven't really explained. Because we saw in the Midrashim that Olah is connected in some way to specific acts of sin. Right? It's connected to asay, love, anitak, and hirhure halev, to positive commandments, to negative commandments associated with positive commandments, and to thoughts. So what I want to do for the rest of the shiur is to try to explain how that fits with the theory that I'm proposing. And what I think we're going to realize as we go through each of these three examples is that all three of these categories are things that don't require real, bona fide, sin-directed, chatat-like kapara, but they're all things that do require exactly what the Olah does, which is kaparat hagavra, which is the cleansing of the person and the spiritual personality and the bringing of the person closer to God. So I'm sorry to skip around, but we're going to go a little bit of a backwards order. Skip to page 6 to source 20, and we're going to start with Ascent, with the neglect of a positive commandment. So as, remind me your name, sorry?
Cheryl?
Yeah, so as Cheryl noted for us, when you neglect a positive commandment, you haven't actually done anything, right? When I violate a prohibition, I have to be active about it. I have to eat that non-kosher food. I have to go out of my way to do labor on Shabbat. But neglecting to, put up a mezuzah in my house, I haven't done anything. I'm just sitting in my house. And so for that reason, there's no masa avera, there's no act of sin that needs kapara, that needs to specifically be atoned for. And if you take a look at the Gemara in Yuma, the Gemara actually relates to this on a halachic level. The Gemara here is describing the different ways to atone for different categories of violation. And it formulates the rule that when it comes to an asay, avar al asay b'sha'av, if one fails to perform a positive commandment, but then he repents, he expresses his regret and his desire to do better next time, he doesn't even have to move from his seat. God forgives him right away on the spot because he hasn't done anything wrong, and now he's shown that he wants to be better next time. But it's not so simple when you've transgressed a negative commandment. If you skip down a line, avar al lo taseh v'asa teshuvah, if you violate a prohibition and then you repent, that's not enough. Teshuvah tola, the repentance kind of suspends a reaction from God, but Yom HaKippur mechaper. We need something. We need, in this case, the day of Yom Kippur to come and offer us some real atonement for that. But when it comes to an asay, we don't need real atonement. But what do we need? And so I think that here, there's an amazing idea of the Ramban in source 21 about the respective nature of mitzvot asay and mitzvot lo taseh that can help us appreciate what it is that we need after we violated an asay, and how the Olah and the type of kapara that Olah has is the perfect thing to do just that job. So the Ramban argues that mitzvot asay, positive commandments, reflect what ahavat Hashem, love of God, whereas negative commandments reflect yirat Hashem, fear of God. So we'll see that inside. If you look at the end of the fourth line in the Ramban, he says, "Ha'oseh mitzvat Adonav achuv lo, va'Adonav mirachim alav." That one who does that which his Creator commanded him, he is beloved to him, and his Master will have mercy on him. Meaning the fact that I'm going out of my way to do things for God, it expresses my love of God, my desire to do for God. Whereas if you skip down a few lines, Hanishmar me'asot davar ra be'inei adonav yarei ota. The fact that I'm afraid to do that which God has prohibited me shows that I'm afraid of God. And the Ramban says these aren't just two different ways to serve God, there's a hierarchy here. One is better than the other. Lachin mitzvot aseh gdola mi mitzvot lo taseh. Therefore, says the Ramban, fulfilling positive commandments is much more valuable than refraining from violating negative commandments. Kimosha ava gdola mehayira. Because says the Ramban, ava and love of God is much more powerful than fear of God. Right? Or the relationship has to be based in order to be a relationship in that love and not just in that fear. And he goes on to elaborate, it's much greater when I'm spending my time, my resources, and all of my effort on doing what God wants from me than it is when I'm trying to make sure I don't do something that God told me not to do. And I think it's important to note here that the distinction that the Ramban is making isn't just a distinction between being active and being passive. Because there are plenty of prohibitions that require active work on our part to ensure that we don't violate them. I think probably experientially the best example of this is the isser of having chametz on Pesach. How much do we do to make sure that we don't have chametz? And yet, when we're doing that, our focus is on making sure that we don't do the wrong thing. And says the Ramban, it's more valuable, not that we shouldn't do that, we should definitely do that, but what's more valuable is that focus on doing the right thing. And we might think that this seems kind of unusual, because we tend to think of mitzvot lo taseh as being more severe and more serious, because they come with greater punishments than the neglect of positive commandments. But the Ramban says that that idea, that there's punishments for violating prohibitions, and there aren't necessarily punishments for neglecting positive commandments, is not a proof against him. It's actually a proof for him. He says it's specifically because of this, it's specifically for this reason that there's a great punishment for violating a prohibition. And that's why we have things like lashes and the death penalty. Because you have to follow the rules. But when it comes to a mitzvah aseh, we don't really have punishments for mitzvah aseh. The same way that a parent is a lot more likely to punish a child for violating certain rules of the house than they are for punishing a child for not making them a birthday card. It's almost like laughable to think about such a thing. And similarly, says the Ramban, with mitzvot aseh and mitzvot lo taseh. And I think that the idea of connecting aseh to ahava explains to us exactly why an individual who neglected an aseh achieves kapara, achieves atonement for that through the olah. Because if, for example, I haven't davened for the past few days, it's true that I've missed an opportunity to do a mitzvah, and it's true that if I show my sincere regret for that, that'll be enough, God has forgiven me. But now I have to deal with a certain reality, which is that there's been a few days that have passed when I haven't spoken to God at all. And I have to deal with the fact that what does this reflect about me as a person? Am I really making enough time in my life for God? Right? What is my spiritual personality like such that I was able to go a few days without davening, without speaking to God? And that's where the olah comes in. And the olah is about this voluntary choice to offer something to God, bring this gift to God, and that choice to bring that gift sort of brings you back in close contact with God. It reconciles you with God after this lapse in the relationship that occurred through your neglect of the mitzvot aseh. And we mentioned that the second thing in the Midrash was lav hanitak la'aseh, a prohibition attached to a positive commandment. So the Chasei David, one of the early commentaries on the Tosefta, suggests that the idea of olah, offering atonement for lav hanitak, sorry, it's not on the source sheet, I'm just going to say it outside, I could only find it, I didn't have like a copy online, so I was trying to take pictures of it, and then I figured I could just say it out loud instead, so I apologize for that. But he essentially says that it can't be that the olah actually atones for the prohibition that you violated. Olah doesn't atone for prohibitions. It must be that what it atones for is your failure to correct your prohibition with the positive commandment. So before I gave you the example of stealing, and that being corrected by returning the stolen object, so he says that the Olah can't atone for the fact that you stole, but it can atone for your failure to go and actively now fix and do something about it. So the explanation for La Hanita would be the same as the explanation for Ascent. So now we have one more category to address, and that's the category of Herkure Halim, of sinful thoughts. And I think here, we actually have a much easier job. So if you flip back, page 6, to source number 17, the Gemara in Kiddushin. The Gemara is discussing a case of an individual who was observed falling to their death while doing a mitzvah. And the Gemara is trying to understand, how could this be? How could an individual be punished while they're in the performance of a mitzvah? And the Gemara suggests, Dilma mehar herba ve'rahava. It looked to us like they were being righteous, but perhaps in their mind they were sinning. Perhaps they were having sinful thoughts. But the Gemara immediately dismisses this option. Machshava ra ina kadosh baruch hu mitzarfa l'maseh. The Gemara says that can't be the problem because God doesn't hold us accountable for sinful thoughts. They're not considered like actions. We're not punished for the thoughts that go on in our minds. And so it's very clear here that there's no sin to atone for. But there are consequences. There's consequences for us as people, and as people that want to be close to God, when we have thoughts that move us away from God. There's a sense of alienation, and there's also this sense of that I, as an individual, feel like I'm spiritually rotten, feel like I have some kind of spiritual deficit. And these consequences, I think, are articulated by this very striking formulation in the Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara says that herhure avera kashu me'avera, that thoughts of sin are actually worse than the sin itself. And this Sfat Emet, who is generally known for his Hasidic work, but also has a phenomenal commentary on Shas that's actually amazing. So he says that this isn't talking at the objective level. Of course, objectively, we know that it's worse to sin, and that God is going to punish us if we sin, and not going to punish us if we think sinful thoughts. But what we are referring to is a subjective level. And he explains that herhure avera kashu me'avera nir'eh de kasha lenefesh mamash ka'amar. That it's more difficult, it's worse for the individual soul. Why? Shekashe l'takin atzmo kishenitba bahem yoter milafrosh me'avera. That it's harder for the individual to fix himself when he's sort of become entrenched in these thoughts than it is for him to separate himself from sinful action. And I think if we think about when we do something that we feel like we don't identify with, we did the wrong thing and we know it and we regret it, we'll often say something like, I wasn't thinking when I did that. And that sort of implies distance between ourselves and the action. But there is no distance that we can make between ourselves and our thoughts. We can't say I wasn't thinking. Those are our thoughts. They're who we are as spiritual people. And so I think here it's very clear why this notion of kaparas hagavra, of atoning for who we are as individuals vis-a-vis God, becomes extremely important. And that's the thing that we need to deal with the consequence of these sinful thoughts that we're having. And so essentially, I think what all three of these categories have in common is that they're not active violations, which require real kapara, real atonement for sins, but they are things that reflect back on who we are as spiritual individuals. And before Matan Torah, the Olah was in some sense a one-sided korban. It was a way for us to give a gift to God, to display our submission to God. But in Sefer Vayikra, the Olah becomes a korban. It's transformed into a korban about the relationship with God, a korban of Amma. It's not just about what we do for Hashem, but about how Hashem responds and what He does for us in return. If we think about the formulation in the pesukim, it's v'nirtzeh lo l'chaper Allah. It's when God accepts the korban, when He agrees to draw us closer after we express the desire to come closer. That is what's l'chaper Allah. That is what atones for us. That is what fixes us as spiritual people and helps us stand closer to God. And I think all of this helps us to really appreciate and understand why the Olah is a voluntary offering. Why is it that when an individual fails to perform an aseh, the Torah doesn't demand of them to bring an Olah to achieve atonement? Why don't we make it a requirement? once we appreciate that the Olah is meant to compensate and fix the lapses in Avad Hashem, it becomes clear that the Olah must be voluntary. If you feel as though someone isn't showing you the care and the love that you want, the fact that you're forcing them to do so isn't going to make you feel any better about it. It's specifically the fact that we're volunteering, we're showing God that we want to bring something with Him, that we want to Him, that we want to come closer, that allows us to achieve that kapara. And so, in order for Olah to be a kapara, it must also be a doro. It must also be a gift. These things aren't two mutually exclusive options. They come together and they reinforce each other. The fact that we're bringing a gift to God, that transforms us. And that creates a kapara, a love, on us as entire people, not just on particular actions that we've done. And after thinking about this, I noticed actually that the Ramban in source 23 in the bottom of page 7, now we're going backwards. The Ramban has certain formulations in his comment in Vayikra, and I underlined them for you, that point in this direction. When the Ramban is speaking about the kapara of Olah, he says, B'zeh yiratzeh, be'olah hazo, im yaviena b'mitzvat nafsha. That when is the Olah a kapara? When it's brought specifically b'mitzvat nafsho, out of the generosity of the heart. And later on, the Ramban goes on to say, in the final line, how do these individuals gain the favor of their master? Again, it's through this gift, it's through this doron. And so there's one final point that I want to end with, to just tie everything together. But before that, I just want to take time if people have any questions about anything that I just said. I mean, you can also ask questions after, but I want to give a pause for questions. Yeah.
So, is the Korban Olah, it can be given by itself or together, or only together with it?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is that it can totally be given by itself on its own. It can also be brought with a chatat, but it can also be brought on its own. Okay. So the one final point that I want to end with is something that we noted all the way at the beginning, which is that the distinctive feature of the Olah, what makes it different than every other korban, is the fact that it's totally burnt on the Mizbeach. And so I think that if this theory of Olah is a good one, it has to be able to fit with and explain that fact. Why is it that the Olah is totally burnt up? And if you look back for a moment at source 12, which was the Gemara, I believe it's on page 4. Yes, the Gemara, the Mishnah in Zvachim, when the Mishnah says that the blood of the chatat comes before the blood of the Olah, the Mishnah goes on to say, Ivare Olah chutmen le'imure chatat mipni she'in kalil le'ishin. That when it comes to the limbs being burnt on the Mizbeach, the limbs of the Olah take precedent to the limbs of the chatat because the Olah is totally consumed, whereas the chatat is only partially consumed. And so we see that the distinctive feature and the feature that makes Olah kind of more mekudash, more sanctified than the chatat, is this full burning of the limbs. But what does that mean? What's the significance of fully burning the Olah? So I actually came across this a few years ago, and it really stuck with me. It's a piece from Rabbi Ezra Bick, who's one of the Rabbanim and teachers at Yeshivat Har Etzion. And he writes about this experience that he once had where he was in a library and he was reading like an English translation of Vayikra, an old English translation, and he kept seeing this phrase that was repeated over and over again, and he didn't understand what it was meant to be a translation of. The phrase was to turn into smoke. And he kept thinking, like, what words in the Torah mean that? And he realized that it was actually translating the phrase lahaktir, which is what we do with the Olah. We're maktir, we're maktir the entire thing. And we generally tend to translate that as to burn. That's the translation I've been using. We burn the whole thing. But Rabbi realized that this translation was actually the correct one. If we wanted to talk about burning, we would say l'srof, to burn. But lahaktir literally means to turn into smoke. So what's the significance of that? So Rabbi explains that the act of burning something is a destructive act. It's the act of totally getting rid of something. But that's not what we're doing with the Olah. We're not getting rid of it. We're not burning it. Rather, we're transforming it. We're taking it from what it is as animal body, and we're transforming it into something else, into smoke. If you look at the bolded part, Rabbi says, Korban turn meat into smoke. They transform the material into spiritual. The symbolism of Haftarah, says Rabbi, is the symbolism of taking something kind of coarse from the material world and entirely transforming it into something spiritual. And he goes on to say, reading the bolded part, that sacrificing an animal or other possessions of ours creates a real bridge between two worlds that are logically unbridgeable. The transcendent heavens, spiritual purity, and the physical world, coarse and material. And this is true, all korbanos have this element to some degree. They have some of the parts that are brought in the Mizbeach and turned into smoke, but it's the most true when it comes to the Olah, where the entire thing is burnt, or is not burnt, is maktir, is turned into smoke. And I think this fits perfectly with what we were saying about the Olah, because Haftarah is really something that's about the relationship with Hashem. It's about creating a bridge between our physical world and the spiritual world. And that's why we bring the Olah when we recognize our own failure in taking advantage of opportunities in our own lives to turn the physical into the spiritual. And we mentioned that an individual can volunteer an Olah even when they don't have particular sins in mind, because I think the Olah is also the Korban of aspiration. It's of aspiring to transcend our physical being and to do more than we can. And as Rabbi said, we're creating the bridge between that which appears to us to be totally unbridgeable. And the idea that we started with of the Olah just as a gift, as something that we give to God, that idea isn't necessarily a uniquely Jewish one. But I think this notion of Haftarah, the notion of creating, bridging between these two worlds, really is a unique contribution that we got at Matan Torah when we were told that the Olah had this power to create this effect. And as we said, that the key of the kapara of Olah comes after the nirtzeh love. When God agrees, when he accepts you back, that transforms who you are as an individual. And I just want to end with this line from Slichot that I came across as I was kind of thinking about these ideas and kind of preparing a little bit in my mind for this year. During Slichot, I saw this line and I was like, whoa, this encapsulates in like 2 words exactly the point that I want to make in this year. So I was very excited about it. So the Paitan, the poet who wrote this Slicha, is discussing our desire to have the Beit HaMikdash return. And he notes that what happened when we had the Beit HaMikdash, halo chatat mechaparet v'ha'olah machsharet. That the chatat was mechaper, it atoned, it erased particular sins. But that's not what the Olah did. Olah machsharet, to be machshir something is to make something fit for a particular purpose. And what Olah does is it takes us as people and it renders us spiritually fit to be standing in front of God in a closer proximity than we have before. So thank you so much for listening and for learning with me. I'm happy if you have questions, also to meet everyone, and thank you.